what a pleasure it is to be with all of you. Thank you, each of you, for saying yes to be part of Ignite Your Torch. Tamara, I know you're working, you're taking photographs now, but before I get started, to you and to your dear mother, Theo, to all who were involved in this planning, thank you. To my brother priests and deacons, seminarians, servers, women religious, men religious, all of you who are here today, parents, and those who have assisted in these days, thank you for this work. You know, you who are participants, say a little prayer of thanksgiving for the person who invited you. Now, they may have invited you by simply saying, would you come with me? Or maybe they just kind of got you in the car and brought you here. I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter, because what is most important is you had a great opportunity to experience the great love of Jesus Christ and the great call of Christ to you personally. I look at you and I think, you know, you are the light of the world. God has destined you. I don't know what God's plan is for you, and you may not at this moment know, but you are called to be the light of the world. Jesus said that each one of his followers is to be a light of the world, and you remember it, we're not supposed to put a bushel basket on top of that light. We're not supposed to hide the light. He also said that you are yeast. And you know, when you make bread and you put yeast into dough, that dough rises. It means that the yeast has an effect on many. And so it is that you're called, I don't know to whom. 50 years ago, this summer, I entered the seminary. And a year before that, I began to discern a call to the priesthood. I can remember distinctly, I was in a Catholic high school, and we had the opportunity to pray in chapel. We had a choice, either go to study hall or pray in chapel. I'm not sure why I started to pray. Maybe I didn't have the exactly right motivation. But in silent prayer, 50 years later, I can still sense, in some ways, Christ speaking to me. It wasn't as if I heard a distinct voice, but it was that pull, that attraction. I also had the blessing of coming from a wonderful family, and some of you know that I was the baby in the family. That's not the part I want to let everybody know, but so that's just between us. But I had an older brother, my brother George, who had Down syndrome, and boy, did my brother George have an effect on my family, on me, quite honestly, on my parish. I came from a little coal town in the northeast part of Pennsylvania, and everybody in that coal town knew about my brother George and knew about the effect. See, sometimes God gives us a gift to slow us down and really uncover what is truly good and right in our lives. I hope this weekend is that discernment. Some of you will undoubtedly be called to the great sacred vocation of matrimony. Some will be called, perhaps, to the consecrated life, to the priesthood. Some will be called to the blessed single life. In a sense, it's a great adventure to uncover the grace that God has given to you. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the two things that are in sacred Scripture that stand in the way of you embracing, first of all, uncovering, and then embracing God's plan for you. And maybe over these couple of days, I looked at your program, you probably have heard about these two things. The first is what I would call a false idea of what it means to be free. And the second is, if you're human as I am, boy, do we make excuses. So I'd like to talk about both of those. What it means to be free, and then What do we do when we're tempted to make excuses instead of following Christ with all our hearts? First of all, to be free. How many of you remember that movie of a few years ago, Home Alone? Do you ever remember it? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, very good. Then I don't have to explain the whole thing to you. It's about, I don't know if that young man was maybe 6 or 7 years old. A similar thing happened to someone. This was a young man who was only 6 years old. It happened to be the anniversary of the wedding of his mom and dad, and they were all set to go out for a nice dinner. And he said to them, because the babysitter had called up, she was sick and could not come. He says, Mom and Dad, I'm 6 years old. I can take care of myself. You go out and have a good time. They got in the car, they backed out of the driveway, they began to go down the street, and he was standing in the living room just by himself, 6 years old. And he looked around and he said to himself, I am free. I can do anything I want. And he went into the kitchen and he opened up the freezer. And there was not one, but there were 2 half-gallons of ice cream. And he said to himself, I am free. I can do anything I want. And in the course of about an hour and a half, with just one spoon, he was able to devour not one, he's 6 years old, not one, but 2 half-gallons of ice cream. And at 2 o'clock the next morning, he felt the full effects of freedom. And so there was a graduate of high school. Her mom and dad were so proud of her. And she graduated from high school and she went off to college at a distant town. And she moved into the dorm and she put her suitcases down and she looked around the room. And she said to herself, I am free. I can do anything I want. Now, what's the problem with the notion of freedom, which is a freedom from restrictions? You know, we're told that the new atheism, I noticed you had, some of you may have gone to the talk that you had on the new atheism. The new atheism basically is saying, we don't believe in God because we believe that God, that Jesus Christ, that religion is the enemy of freedom. That if we truly want to be free, we shouldn't have anything stopping us from doing whatever we happen to want to do at that moment. Does that remind you of anyone? Maybe that little 6-year-old, or perhaps that freshman in college, tempted to misuse her first chance at true freedom. See, freedom, St. Paul said in the readings, the second reading, it was his letter to the Galatians. He said, freedom is not a freedom from all restrictions. It's not a freedom of the flesh. That kind of freedom can get us into trouble, into what the world has come to understand as addictions. And you all know addictions as well as I do. You can be addicted to drugs. People young age, people your own age can get addicted to drugs or to alcohol, to improper relationships. Instead of healthy friendships, they can get involved in relationships that tear down, that kind of pretend to be marriage when they're really not. They're not a permanent vow. And they can be deceptive because at first, take the example of drugs. Somebody takes drugs and they think, wow, all my problems are gone. I don't have to worry about anything. I feel good. Well, come back a year later when that person says, boy, was I wrong. Was I sold a bill of goods? That wasn't freedom. That was a new imprisonment. Blessed John Paul II, after he rejoiced some 20 years ago with the liberation, if you will, of his home country of Poland, because he knew what it was to be oppressed by communism, atheistic communism, where there wasn't the freedom to worship, the freedom of religion. But then he warned about a new oppression, and he said, materialism, simply trying to take what you want when you want it, is a new type of prison, and it's not a true freedom. The freedom of the sons and daughters of Christ is what you and I are called to. And it's a freedom that seeks God's plan in our life. And boy, when we get on the path, what you've been doing these last 3 days, when we get on the path looking at God's plan for our life, it may be different for each one of us, but the commonality is the closer we get to Christ, the closer we get to one another, and the more permanent is our happiness. A happiness that will only fully be with us, as you know, in heaven. We're in the midst of the fortnight of freedom, and this is why it's so important. We've had a lot of assaults on freedom within our world. I was ordained in 1973. The first letter to the editor, I was ordained actually in 1972. If you tell my classmates I got it wrong, I'll deny it. But in 1973, I wrote in January my first letter to the editor. 40 years ago, when the Supreme Court got it wrong and did not defend life in the womb. We're going to have, at the end of the prayer of the faithful, a blessing of the child in the womb today, at this very Mass. It's a testimony that no matter what the Supreme Court said, it doesn't change the truth, does it? Thank you, so many of you who were able to come on the bus yesterday to the abortion clinic and pray a rosary for life. What a great witness to each other, to the world, and even to people who are tempted to take life for granted and even tempted to take life in the womb. No, the Supreme Court decision was wrong, and we are still working and working hard to be apostles for life. Last week, 40 years later, the Supreme Court got it wrong again, and we're going to have to work even harder. They said that we who defend the natural gift of marriage, we know that the marriage of one man and one woman, a permanent and forever vow that is open to new life to children, the best way that children can ever be raised with their own mom and dad, we know that that's not something we can change. We can regulate it, the church does, and the church, also the state regulates it. That's because it's so important to our society. We've been told that to defend life is to show malice to people who have same-sex attractions. That's wrong too. Christ calls us to love every human being, but the vision of sexuality is meant to give true freedom to all, and we don't want to go down a path that will change the definition of marriage. So important that you and I become knowledgeable and prayerful. We need to become, I'll say it, many experts. And why can't you be? You're going to be good in geometry, you're going to be good in chemistry, you're going to be good in some fields that algebra, for example, which I could never figure out. You're going to be good in so many things. Why can't you be good in understanding morally why the natural gift of marriage is so essential to our society and to our church? Thank you for your willingness to do that. This uncovers, if you will, the true gift of freedom. It's a precious gift that we should not take for granted, especially now as we approach the 4th of July. So what's the other barrier? I know you want to embrace freedom. The other barrier, of course, is that you and I are very good at making excuses. Jesus, of course, knows that because he knew the Old Testament well. He knew that Moses, when he was called, said, well, I'm too old. And he knew that the prophet Jeremiah, when he was called, said, I'm too young. And he knew that the prophet Isaiah, when he was called, said, well, I'm not pure enough. And he knew that the prophet Elijah, whom we heard in the first reading, says, Lord, my nerves can't take it. See, we have a million excuses for why we cannot follow Christ with our whole hearts. And yet the truth is, to be free and to be faithful go together. And so you and I, and you especially, as the present and future of our church, you're called to be men and women of joy. You're called to be men and women of conviction, of charity, and of a willingness to declare yourself publicly a follower of Christ. And may God bless you, because we need you, free young people, willing to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ. May God bless you.